Hey there, friend. Thanks for joining me during this peaceful hour where we're about to dive into a story from a time and place far from our own, yet still deeply human. Whether you're here to drift off to sleep or just slow down your evening, I'm glad you're here. I'd really like to know where in the world you're listening from, the city or country, and what time it is as you hit play. It's pretty cool how stories from the past can connect us, no matter where we are. If you find tranquility in these calm, historical tales, consider hitting that subscribe button. We've got plenty more stories that promise to ease us into a quiet night. Now, onto a topic we've all probably had a bit of a moan about: modern dating. Yes, dealing with dating apps that lead nowhere, being ghosted, or enduring awkward coffee dates can be frustrating. But imagine a time when your biggest worry wasn't if someone would text back, but if they'd even make it through the winter. Or think about having to ask a feudal lord for permission to date someone because they were considered property. Or what about making sure the person you're interested in doesn't have any open sores or hasn't been accused of witchcraft lately? Compared to medieval dating, our worst Tinder nightmares seem pretty tame. Back then, love was often seen as a luxury that many couldn't afford. Marriages were more about business deals, and people had as much say in their love lives as livestock at a market. In the next few parts of our story, we're going to look into why finding love in the medieval period was so tough. We'll see how a strict class system made romance a game of politics, how the Catholic Church had a say in pretty much every aspect of personal relationships, and how a lack of basic hygiene made physical attraction, well, a bit of a challenge. But here's the kicker. A lot of the dating issues we think are new problems actually started way back in these medieval times. The pressure to marry young, arranged relationships, they all began back then. So, stay tuned as we unravel the tangled web of medieval love and maybe find some comfort in knowing that some things aren't as new as they seem. The template for thinking that romance has to be all about drama and suffering, that comes straight from the medieval courtly love scenes, which were set up to be goals nobody could really hit. First off, let's chat about how the lack of choice back then makes swiping left or right seem like a dream. Imagine you're in a tiny village with maybe 50 folks, half of whom you're related to. A quarter are taken, and the rest? They're either too young, too old, or have been snagged by the local big shot for a marriage that's more about politics than love. In those days, who you ended up with wasn't about vibes or mutual hobbies. It was all about your social rank, your family's bank balance, and often decisions made by people who didn't know you from Adam. Thinking about dating different people, or wild thought, marrying for love, that was basically unheard of. Actually, it was seen as risky and almost rebellious. For the vast majority who were peasants, romance was a bit of a pipe dream. When you're grinding from dawn to dusk just to get by, when one bad crop can mean your family goes hungry, and when you're pretty much at the mercy of a lord who doesn't see you as much more than a tool, love takes a back seat to survival. For most peasants, getting hitched was more about, can this person plow a field? Or do they come with a cow? Rather than, do they make my heart flutter? Marriages were arranged with an eye on practical stuff, like if the other person could help you stay alive. The whole concept of romance? Not even on the radar, because it was viewed as a distraction from the grim business of making it through another day. And here's the kicker. Even if you found someone you genuinely clicked with, tying the knot wasn't up to you. The local lord had the final say on whether you could marry them, and they could just as easily shoot it down. If you were good at your job back in the day, your boss might stop you from marrying someone from a different town because he didn't want to lose you. That's how much control they had. But you might think, hey, at least the rich folks had it better, right? Not really. When you were rich and powerful, getting married was less about love and more about strategy. Your wedding could decide the fate of thousands. It was all about forming military alliances, gaining land, and holding on to power. For the kids of nobles, especially the girls, it was like being pawns in a giant chess game. A young noblewoman could end up promised to some guy she'd never met, who might be way older, all because the marriage would help her family gain some advantage. And if she wasn't happy about it, too bad. Complaining could be seen as betraying her family. And then there's the really creepy part. Back then, they didn't really see kids as kids. Girls could be promised in marriage as young as 7 and were expected to be wives and mothers by the time they were 12 or 13. These weren't child marriages in the way we'd think. These were little girls married off to much older men for their family's gain. A 12-year-old girl might have to run a house, have kids, and deal with adult politics when she should be playing. The whole situation was as dangerous as it sounds. Many young women in medieval times faced deadly risks during childbirth, and it wasn't just because medical knowledge was lacking. Their bodies often weren't ready for the physical demands of pregnancy and childbirth. The intense pressure to produce male heirs meant that if a woman survived her first pregnancy, she was quickly expected to try for a second and then a third, continuing until she either had a son or died in the process. Men, on the other hand, had a slightly different set of challenges. Young noblemen might have had a bit more freedom when it came to choosing their romantic partners, but they were still expected to marry for political advantage rather than love. And if they were younger sons without any hope of inheritance, they could be pushed into joining the church, regardless of their personal feelings about religion, effectively ending any chance they had at marriage. But here's the really twisted part. The medieval period is also when the concept of romantic love, as we know it today, first came about. The tradition of courtly love, spread by troubadours and poets, painted an idealized picture of romance that was completely unattainable. It usually involved a knight hopelessly in love with a married noblewoman, dedicating years to performing grand acts of devotion without ever consummating the relationship. This wasn't just for entertainment. It served as a way for people to dream about passionate love while still adhering to the strict marriage rules that society relied on for stability. Unfortunately, this tradition also planted the idea that true love had to be torturous, impossible, and ideally, tragic. It's a notion that has persisted over the centuries, leading many to believe that easy, straightforward relationships are somehow less romantic than ones filled with drama and complications. And just imagine trying to navigate romance in a time when basic hygiene practices, like brushing teeth, were virtually non-existent. Back in the day, taking a bath was seen as a risky move for your health, and to keep from stinking after months without a wash, people would rub herbs on themselves as a makeshift perfume. Because of this, being physically attracted to someone wasn't straightforward, since most folks by today's standards looked and smelled pretty bad. No one really took care of their teeth, which led to a lot of people losing them and having breath that was downright lethal. Skin problems were everywhere, from the common acne to more severe stuff like scrofula, which left visible lumps and sores. What's weirder is how back then, people's views on sexuality and desire were heavily influenced by the church, which saw any kind of physical pleasure as bad. According to the Catholic Church, sexual desire, even in marriage, was something to tolerate only for making babies, not something to enjoy. This mindset created a society where showing sexual interest, especially for women, was seen as morally wrong. Women were thought to be in cahoots with the devil if they were too into physical pleasure, while men were supposed to keep their desires in check. But really, women were supposed to act like they didn't have any desires at all. This whole situation made dating, if you could even call it that, extremely complicated. The basics of a romantic relationship, like being attracted to each other, feeling a connection, and enjoying each other's company, were all viewed with suspicion or even hostility. And we haven't even touched on how the church had a say in every part of a couple's relationship, how diseases and the constant presence of death made thinking about the future tough, or how the ever-present threat of violence made every potential romantic encounter super risky. In short, dating during medieval times was like navigating a minefield that combined the worst bits of arranged marriages, religious fanaticism, and terrible social inequality, treating love as either something dangerous and extravagant or as a political tool. Imagine being frustrated with modern dating. It's not perfect, but at least you have the freedom to choose your partner, express your desires without fear, and live long enough to see how your relationship pans out. Back in medieval times, these basic freedoms were unheard of. As day broke over the cramped villages of medieval Europe, the harsh realities of dating were even more glaring under the bright sunlight. And if you think the social restrictions were tough, the physical dangers involved in medieval romance were even scarier. With no modern medicine or basic hygiene, something as simple as holding hands could be deadly. Now, picture yourself as a young peasant woman, around 15, catching the eye of a farmer's son. Your families let you walk together after church on Sundays, but always under strict supervision. Walking through the village wasn't just about navigating physical paths. It was like moving through a minefield of disease, filth, and danger. This would make even the worst dating apps look like a walk in the park. The streets weren't paved, but were filthy with human and animal waste, rotting food, and who knows what else. The stench was so bad it could knock you out. Pigs and chickens roamed freely, adding to the mess and smell. In summer, the heat made the stench unbearable, causing people to faint. But the smell was the least of your worries. Every step was a risk, exposing you to deadly diseases like cholera and dysentery, which are almost unheard of today. Imagine trying to find love in a time when diseases spread through poorly prepared food, and typhoid fever could hit out of nowhere. The Black Death might be the most notorious killer of the medieval period, but it was just one of many diseases that could ruin your love life for good. Now, picture trying to have a heart-to-heart with someone you like while dodging these health hazards. It's not easy to get cozy and whisper sweet nothings when the person next to you could be carrying a bunch of infectious diseases. And sharing food or drinks? In medieval times, that could be like playing a dangerous game of chance. Without any real dental care, getting close meant braving some seriously bad breath. Without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or even a basic understanding of dental hygiene, most people's mouths were a mess. Teeth would fall out by the time people hit their 20s, gums were often bleeding, and the smell of decay was so normal, it was just part of life. But let's say you're really into someone and can look past the nightmare of medieval hygiene. You're still not out of the woods. Medieval towns and villages were pretty hazardous places. Buildings could collapse at any moment because no one really cared about construction standards. Fires were a constant threat too. With everything being made of wood and thatch, and people cooking over open flames in their homes, a cozy night in could quickly turn into a life-or-death situation if a stray spark lit up the place. On top of all that, you had to worry about the violence. Medieval society was rough, and danger wasn't just on the battlefields or in tavern fights. Domestic violence was a grim reality too, showing that finding and maintaining love in medieval times was a minefield of dangers, both big and small. Back in the day, it was totally okay for a husband to beat his wife without facing any real consequences, as long as he didn't go as far as killing her. Women were stuck with no way out. They couldn't turn to the law, there were no shelters to run to, and they didn't have their own money to just get up and leave an abusive situation. Even if the guy seemed nice while you were dating, which was always super supervised, you really had no idea what he'd be like once you got married. And once you were married, that was it. You were stuck. A lot of women ended up finding out too late that their husbands were either mean, violent, or just didn't care about them at all. Getting intimate was a whole other kind of dangerous back then, something we can hardly wrap our heads around today. There was no real knowledge about sexual health or how babies were made, no birth control, and medical care was a joke. So, every time you got together with your partner, you were literally risking your life. STDs were everywhere, causing all sorts of nasty problems, even death. And for women, getting pregnant was like having a death sentence hanging over your head. The chances of dying in childbirth were shockingly high. Somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 4 women didn't make it. And if you did survive having the baby, you were likely left with health issues that messed with you for life. Imagine trying to feel all excited about your wedding night, knowing that getting pregnant could literally kill you. And if you made it through childbirth once, you were pretty much expected to go through it over and over again until you hit menopause or died, whichever came first. Without any reliable birth control, married women spent most of their lives either pregnant or recovering from childbirth. If a woman lived long enough to be an adult, she'd likely give birth to 6 or 7 kids, but a lot of those kids wouldn't make it past their first birthday. Infant mortality was so high that parents often waited months before naming their babies because the odds of the baby dying were just too high. Imagine how emotionally draining it would be to lose child after child, never knowing if the next pregnancy might be your last. Think about the toll on your body from the constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. But even if you managed to get through all these physical dangers, and even if you found a partner who was kind and gentle, and even if you survived multiple pregnancies and childbirth, you'd still have to face the harsh reality that life in medieval times was short and unpredictable. People usually lived between 30 and 40 years, not because they aged faster, but because so many died young due to disease, violence, or accidents, which lowered the average life expectancy. If you were lucky enough to make it past childhood, you might live to see 50 or 60, but that would be considered very old back then. This meant that most romantic relationships didn't last long. You could marry at 15 and be widowed by 25. You might find true love, only to watch your partner die from a disease that could be easily treated today. Death was always nearby, casting a shadow over every relationship and every happy moment. Yet, despite all these challenges, people still fell in love. They wrote poetry, sang songs about their beloved, and risked everything for a chance at happiness, however fleeting it might be. This makes the idea of medieval romance even more touching. When life was so uncertain and death was always just around the corner, every moment of connection, every gentle touch, and every shared smile became incredibly precious. People couldn't take love for granted because they knew how quickly it could disappear. This also meant that romantic relationships were often desperate and intense, in ways that might make us uncomfortable today, especially when you consider that pregnancy could be a death sentence and disease lurked around every corner. Love in medieval times was like playing a high-stakes game with everything on the line. It wasn't just about dealing with minor inconveniences or health risks. It was about facing existential threats that influenced every single aspect of romance and relationships. Falling in love back then meant you had to be incredibly brave, given the overwhelming odds you were up against. As we dive deeper into the horrors of medieval dating, we'll see how physical dangers, combined with social and economic challenges, created a courtship system that's hard for us to even fathom today. Beyond just dodging diseases and the threat of death, there were economic hurdles that could doom a romance before it even had a chance to start. Dating during medieval times was a nightmare for a variety of reasons. Clan warfare, church oppression, and rigid social rules made everyday life tough enough. But the domain of love and relationships was where the brutality of the era was most evident. If you think dating is complicated now, imagine trying to navigate love in a time when a simple kiss could be deadly. Marriages were more like business deals, and courtship was deeply influenced by a toxic mix of religious fanaticism and aristocratic scheming. The way love and marriage were approached was so warped it would make the most dysfunctional modern relationship seem like a dream. It wasn't just about dealing with arranged marriages or the lack of choice. It was a complete undermining of human intimacy, all under the guise of chivalry, romance, and divine approval. At the core of any romantic relationship is physical attraction and intimacy. But in medieval times, even the slightest touch between unmarried people was seen as a grave sin, one that could condemn your soul for eternity. The Catholic Church had essentially made human sexuality something to be deeply ashamed of and feared. Back in the day, people were so scared that a passionate kiss could literally send them to hell. But it wasn't just about feeling guilty because of religion. Getting close to someone could actually be deadly. Back then, nobody really knew about hygiene or how diseases spread, so getting intimate was super risky. Diseases you could get from sex were everywhere, and there was no way to treat or cure them. People didn't even understand how these diseases were passed around. Syphilis was one of the worst. It showed up in Europe in the late medieval period and was brutal. It would mess up people's faces, drive them crazy, and eventually kill them. Imagine trying to have a romantic relationship when just being close could lead to a horrible death. For women, the risks were even scarier. Getting pregnant was like being handed a death sentence that you might just survive. A lot of women died during childbirth. Some people think as many as 1 in 3. And it wasn't just because they didn't know much about medicine. Society's beliefs and practices actually made pregnancy more dangerous. Medical texts from back then said women were like flawed men, with bodies that were cold and wet instead of hot and dry. This totally wrong view of women's bodies meant that treatments for pregnant women were often more harmful than helpful. Doctors might do something like bloodletting to balance the body's fluids, or they'd recommend herbs that could hurt the baby. The church didn't help matters either. They taught that the pain of childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's original sin. So, trying to make childbirth less painful was seen as going against God's will. Women were expected to endure the pain as a form of divine punishment, and any attempt to ease it was considered blasphemous. But let's say you somehow got through the dangers of dating, managed to avoid getting sick, and survived pregnancy. Then you'd have to deal with the actual structure of. In the medieval times, getting married wasn't about finding your soulmate or falling in love. It was more like a business deal between families, and unfortunately, the bride was the product being exchanged. Fathers would haggle over the price for their daughter, just like they were dealing in livestock. The women getting married didn't have a say in any of this. Sometimes, they'd meet their future husband for the first time on their wedding day. Imagine being forced to marry someone you didn't like, or even someone who scared you. The woman's feelings and dreams for her future didn't matter at all. What's even more shocking is how young some of these girls were when they were promised to men. Girls as young as 7 could be betrothed, and by the time they were 12 or 13, they were expected to consummate the marriage. And these weren't marriages to boys their age. These were often much older men, sometimes old enough to be their grandfathers. Take Margaret Bowett, for example. She got married at 6, was a widow by 7, got remarried at 9, and by 13, gave birth to the future King Henry VIII. The childbirth was so traumatic that she couldn't have more kids and suffered health problems for the rest of her life. Sadly, this kind of story wasn't out of the ordinary for noble women. Peasant women had it slightly better in the sense that they might have a bit more say in who they married, but their choices were still very limited. They were stuck between a rock and a hard place because of economic hardship and social pressure. An unmarried peasant woman was in a really tough spot. Without a husband, she had no legal rights, no way to make a living, and no protection from being mistreated or taken advantage of. In those times, getting married was about survival. With the constant threats of famine, disease, and violence, families had to join forces just to get by. For most people back then, the idea of marrying for love was a luxury they couldn't afford. Even among the nobility, who theoretically had more freedom and resources, the political stakes attached to marriage made finding genuine love almost a fantasy. Noble marriages were less about romance and more about diplomatic strategies, like securing territory, forging military alliances, or ending feuds between warring families. The personal happiness of those getting married was often overlooked in favor of these larger political goals. This situation gave rise to the peculiar medieval notion of courtly love, which was, in essence, a romanticization of affairs. Since marriages were arranged for political reasons rather than love, passionate romance was pursued outside of marriage. The literature of courtly love glorified these extramarital relationships, creating a culture that both idolized and condemned forbidden love. Courtly love stories were filled with tales of tragic, impossible romances. Knights would vow eternal love to women they could never be with, longing for a love that was out of their reach, and performing heroic deeds in the name of ladies they could never be with physically. These stories weren't about real, attainable relationships, but were fantasies highlighting love's impossibility in the societal framework of the time. Take, for example, the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, one of the most iconic tales of courtly love. Lancelot, the most distinguished knight of the Round Table, falls hopelessly in love with Queen Guinevere, who is married to his lord and friend, King Arthur. Their love is portrayed as noble and pure, precisely because it is doomed from the start, unable to be consummated without ruining everything they hold dear. This story, like many others, ends in tragedy, with their forbidden love contributing to the fall of Camelot. These narratives weren't just for entertainment. They mirrored the harsh reality that love and marriage were often incompatible in medieval society. Romantic love was tangled with themes of tragedy, the impossibility of fulfillment, and destruction. Love was something to be found outside the bounds of marriage, painting marriage as a union meant for purposes other than love. Back in medieval times, the church had some pretty confusing ideas about sex. They believed that marriage was special and blessed by God, but at the same time, they thought that wanting to have sex was bad, even if you were married. According to them, the only good reason for getting busy was to have kids. Anything else, like doing it for fun, was a big no-no. This kind of thinking meant that even couples who were doing everything by the book felt guilty and ashamed about being close to each other. The church didn't just stop at saying sex for pleasure was wrong. They went into crazy detail about what was and wasn't okay. They had these guides for priests that listed all the do's and don'ts of bedroom activities, including which positions were acceptable, which days you could do it, and how you should feel about it. Hint, not too excited. They were particularly harsh on women, saying that if a woman enjoyed sex, it meant she was giving in to her animal instincts instead of being all spiritual and holy. But guys weren't off the hook either. The church really admired men who could stay celibate, like priests and monks. In their eyes, a married man was kind of a second-rate spiritual being because he couldn't give up sex. So if you were a guy who chose to get married, it was like admitting you weren't strong enough to be super holy. All of this made for a pretty messed up situation when it came to relationships. Couples were supposed to feel bad about something that's a natural part of being together. The church's fixation on staying pure just ended up making everyone feel lousy about themselves and their partners, instead of bringing them closer together. Back in the medieval times, wanting things was often seen as a sign that you weren't morally up to scratch. When it came to marriage, the odds were stacked against women from the get-go, making any idea of a real partnership between husband and wife a pipe dream. According to the laws back then, women were pretty much seen as someone's property. They started off belonging to their dads and then got passed on to their husbands. They had no rights to own anything, make any deals, or even show up in court unless they had a man to speak for them. This setup made marriage less about two people joining forces and more about a woman being handed over like a piece of property. Her main duties were to listen to her husband, have kids, and take care of the house. What she thought or felt didn't matter one bit in the eyes of the law. Even the wedding ceremonies showed this. The bride's dad would literally give her away to the groom, like he was passing on a baton. The bride didn't get to say much. She was there more as the thing being given away than a person starting a new chapter in her life. The law didn't even recognize the concept of marital rape. Once a woman was married, it was assumed she'd agreed to sex whenever her husband wanted, with no way out. This wasn't seen as abuse, but just a husband doing what he was allowed to do. And if a husband got violent, the law was on his side as long as he didn't go too far. There's this old saying, rule of thumb, which supposedly comes from a rule that a guy could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. For women trying to get away from an abusive marriage, the situation was bleak. Getting a divorce was almost impossible, and even if they managed to get one, they'd lose their kids and any money to live on. Leaving a husband meant risking homelessness and having nothing. In short, the whole system was rigged against women, making it incredibly tough for them to have any say in their lives or escape a bad marriage. Women back in the day who didn't want to stay married didn't have great options. One choice was to become a nun, but that needed a big dowry and meant no chance at love or having kids. Some women became anchoresses, locking themselves in tiny cells by churches to pray and live alone forever. But for peasant women, even these choices weren't possible. They didn't have the money for a dowry to join a convent, and without marriage, they lacked economic security. Essentially, they were stuck with no way out of possibly abusive or loveless marriages. On top of that, the way people understood love and attraction in medieval times was pretty scary. Doctors back then thought love was a kind of mental illness, named lovesickness or heroic love, and saw it as a dangerous condition that needed curing. They believed falling in love threw off the body's balance, causing symptoms like not eating, not sleeping, and constantly thinking about the person you're into. To cure this, they do stuff like bloodletting, purging, or even surgery to get rid of these romantic feelings. Some texts said lovesickness happened from staring too much at someone attractive, letting their image stick in your brain. The advice was to avoid the person you liked and distract yourself, treating love as an addiction that had to be kicked. This idea turned even the experience of falling in love into a problem that needed fixing, not something beautiful to enjoy. Young folks showing any kind of romantic interest often went through medical treatments aimed at getting rid of their feelings. In medieval times, the struggle to just stay alive meant that most people didn't have the time or energy to focus on romantic relationships. Peasants, who made up the majority, worked from sunrise to sunset. This hard life didn't leave room for things like extended courtship or romantic gestures. And even if peasants did marry for love, their relationships were often strained by the harsh realities they faced daily. They dealt with chronic hunger, disease, and the constant threat of violence. This created a lot of stress in marriages. Couples often went months without enough food, watching helplessly as their children suffered from malnutrition. The high infant mortality rate was a grim reality, with some estimates suggesting that up to half of all children died before they could reach adulthood. The grief from losing children placed a heavy emotional burden on marriages, as couples struggled to cope with their loss while trying to keep their relationship strong. The cycle of medieval agricultural life added to the stress. During harvest time, couples might work up to 18 hours a day, leaving no time for each other. In winter, they were often stuck together in small, cold homes, leading to tension and conflict because of the close quarters. Noble families faced different kinds of pressures, but these were just as harmful to romantic relationships. Marriages among the nobility were often scrutinized for their political implications. Public displays of affection could be seen as political statements, potentially making a noble wife a target for her husband's enemies. The complex rituals of courtly life also made it difficult for noble couples to find genuine intimacy. They were almost never alone, constantly surrounded by servants and courtiers. This environment made it hard for romantic relationships to flourish among the nobility, just as the hard realities of life did for peasants. In the world of political advisors, even the most private moments couldn't escape being seen through a political lens or becoming the subject of social gossip. Back then, the idea of romantic love as we know it today was unheard of. In medieval times, people didn't think marriage should be about love, shared interests, or emotional connection. Instead, it was all about duty, survival, and forming political alliances. Love, if it happened at all, was something that might bloom after the wedding, not a reason to get married. This isn't to say that people back then didn't feel deeply or form strong bonds. However, such feelings weren't seen as good reasons to make big life choices, like who to marry. What mattered more were family honor, social stability, and religious obligations. The stories from that era show how love was viewed as something that could cause trouble. Often, characters in medieval tales who chose love over duty ended up facing tragedy, madness, or even death. The takeaway was clear. Romantic love was seen as a chaotic force that needed to be kept in check for more practical concerns. Even the stories that seem like they're about happy marriages from back then often have elements that would raise eyebrows today. Take the famous love letters between Abelard and Eloise. Their relationship started when Abelard was Eloise's teacher, and she was just a teenager. The power imbalance and age difference in their relationship would definitely be seen as problematic now. Also, the way consent was understood back then is totally different from today's standards. The notion that both people should really want and agree to any sexual activity wasn't a thing. Women were expected to go along with their husband's wishes, no matter how they felt. And men were often told that if a woman said no, she didn't really mean it, and that keeping at it was the right approach. This mindset led to a culture where forcing someone into sexual activity wasn't taken as seriously as it is today. In medieval literature, stories about men winning women through persistence, trickery, or force were common and seen as romantic. This reflects a society where women's right to sexual autonomy wasn't acknowledged. Additionally, the religious view of marriage as a sacred bond, mirroring the relationship between Christ and the Church, placed huge pressure on couples to appear perfectly harmonious, even if their relationship was far from it. The Church's teaching that earthly relationships were less important than spiritual ones further undermined marriages. Couples were encouraged to prioritize their love for God over their love for each other, creating a hierarchy within the relationship. With the emphasis on the afterlife, people saw less reason to work on their marriages, thinking any suffering would be rewarded in heaven. Medieval society's focus on social hierarchy also made romantic relationships complicated. People were expected to marry within their social class, and relationships that crossed these boundaries were discouraged or outright banned. This made finding a suitable partner difficult, often leading to matches based on status or wealth rather than emotional compatibility. Even if two people were a good match emotionally, they might be kept apart because their marriage wouldn't improve their family's social standing. Back in medieval times, the rules around dating and getting married were super strict, making it really hard for people to get to know each other well before they tied the knot. Men and women weren't allowed to hang out alone much, and whenever they did, someone was always watching. This often meant that by the time they got married, they hardly knew anything about each other. Living conditions back then didn't help matters either. Most people lived in tiny spaces with hardly any privacy. Imagine sharing a one-room house with your whole family and even your animals. And if you were from a noble family, your home was still packed with servants and other workers. This setup made it super tough for couples to have any private moments or sort out their issues quietly. Another big problem was the constant danger everyone lived in. Guys were expected to be ready to fight at a moment's notice, which meant their wives were always worried they wouldn't come back from the next battle. This uncertainty wasn't great for building a stable emotional relationship. For women, the fear of sexual violence was a constant reality, especially during wars when rape was sadly seen as just part of the deal. Even in peacetime, women, especially those from lower classes, had little protection against assault, creating an environment of fear and making it hard for them to feel safe around men. The legal system back then didn't do much to help victims of domestic violence or sexual assault either. Women who spoke up often weren't believed, and on the off chance they were, the consequences for the perpetrators were usually pretty light. The laws were more about protecting men's authority and their property than about keeping individuals safe or happy. So, looking at all these factors, it's pretty clear that finding true love and happiness in relationships was a massive challenge for folks living in the medieval era. Dating and finding love in the medieval period was far from the romantic tales we often hear about. People faced a mix of religious oppression, social constraints, economic pressures, medical ignorance, legal inequality, and constant physical danger. All of these factors combined to make forming meaningful relationships really tough. It was like everything around them was set up to make finding and keeping love almost impossible. The church, the legal system, and even family structures, which you'd think would help, actually made it harder for genuine love and partnership to flourish. While we tend to look back at this time and think about kings, battles, and cathedrals, for most people, the struggle to find love and companionship was a major part of their lives. This struggle was made worse by a society that taught them to be afraid of their own desires, to doubt their feelings, and to see loveless marriages as normal, or even something to aim for. It's a stark reminder of how societies can really mess with our most basic human needs, like the need to love and be loved, and shows us just how far we've come in understanding the importance of love. But even for those lucky enough to find love and get married, there were so many things that could go wrong. Disease was a huge threat to any lasting relationship. Since people back then had a much shorter average lifespan, around 30 years, many marriages were cut short by illnesses. A husband might lose his wife to complications from childbirth, or a young bride could become a widow if a plague hit their village. The Black Death was particularly devastating. So, looking at the bigger picture, the quest for love in medieval times was fraught with dangers and challenges, and even when love was found, keeping it was no easy task. This whole situation shows just how complex and risky the pursuit of love was during this era, where even the happiest stories could have a tragic ending. Across Europe, imagine the sheer terror families felt when a loved one began showing the dreadful black swellings of plague, knowing they only had days left to live. Chronicles from that era tell heart-wrenching tales of households completely wiped out, leaving behind nothing but empty beds and a world filled with grief. In some villages, the death toll was so high that there weren't enough people left to give the deceased proper burials. But plague wasn't the only danger that haunted medieval people. Violence was always lurking, with wars, feuds, and banditry being common. Lovers could be ripped apart at any moment. A young man might promise his beloved he'd return from war, only to die on a battlefield far away, leaving her to wait and wonder about his fate for years. The story of Eleanina and Thomas is a perfect example of such tragedies. Eleanina, a lord's daughter, was promised in marriage for a political alliance, but was deeply in love with Thomas, a knight serving her father. Their secret romance, filled with stolen kisses and whispered vows, seemed like something out of a song. However, when Thomas decided to join a crusade, Eleanina begged him not to go. Despite her pleas, he felt honor-bound to leave, hoping to prove himself worthy of her hand. They shared one last night together, making promises known only to them. Sadly, Thomas never came back, dying of fever far from home, and Eleanina was left to fulfill her arranged marriage. Though she went on to have children and grandchildren, those who knew her said she never truly smiled again, her spirit having died with Thomas in a far-off desert. These stories reflect the harsh realities many faced during those times. Back in medieval times, finding and keeping love was pretty much a luxury that most people couldn't afford. Life was tough back then, and happiness was always just out of reach, threatened by all sorts of things nobody could control. For people like farmers, things were even tougher. If a farmer died from an accident, disease, or just from working too hard, his wife would be in a really bad spot. Without his protection and income, she could end up with nothing unless she managed to get remarried fast. But that was easier said than done, especially with young kids to take care of. A lot of widows ended up having to beg, steal, or worse, just to make ends meet. The church wasn't much help to those with broken hearts either. According to religious teachings back then, getting too wrapped up in love was a distraction from focusing on God. Priests would go around saying that loving your spouse too much could actually risk your soul, as it took away from worshiping God properly. So, marriages weren't really about love and romance. They were more about survival and having kids. This created a weird situation where the very things that made life worth living, love, desire, and enjoying each other's company, were considered bad for your spiritual health. Husbands and wives were supposed to care for each other, but not too much. Being too passionate was a no-no and something you'd have to confess and make up for. Then there was this whole tradition of courtly love that just made things harder for real-life couples. This was all about noble knights and their love for ladies they couldn't have, setting these impossible standards for what love should be like. Imagine being a tired farmer trying to live up to these stories, or his wife feeling worn out and not at all like the perfect ladies described in poems. The difference between the romantic tales and the grim reality was huge. While songs and stories talked about eternal love and pure hearts, real life was far from that. Back in the day, keeping a family fed and alive was a major struggle for couples. Having time for romance was something only the rich and idle could afford. For most people, even being physically close with their partner was complicated. The church said that wanting to be with someone physically, even if you were married, was wrong, unless you were trying to have a baby. And even then, you were supposed to be as uninterested in the process as possible. There were so many rules about when couples couldn't be together, like during Lent, Advent, feast days, fast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. When you added it all up, there were only about 40 days a year when couples were supposed to be together. But what made love even harder was the constant fear of losing someone. In those times, it was common for children to die young, diseases to pop up out of nowhere, and danger to be just around the corner. Loving someone deeply was really brave because it meant you were opening yourself up to a lot of pain. Because getting too attached to anyone, whether it was a spouse, child, parent, or friend, could lead to a lot of heartache. People learned to keep their feelings to themselves. Despite all these challenges, love still found a way. People still fell for each other, shared secret moments of joy, and made plans to build a future together, even though they knew how uncertain life could be. The letters and poems from back then show us that they felt the same kind of love, passion, and heartbreak that we do. There's stories of a merchant writing to his wife while he was away, a mother grieving over a child she lost, and a young couple dreaming of their life together. These stories reach out to us from the past, showing us that, despite the tough times, their hearts loved just as deeply as ours do today. Reflecting on the love stories from those days, with all the separations caused by death, duty, and hard times, it makes us realize how lucky we are to live in a time where love can really have a chance to blossom. In a world where medical care can keep us together longer, where we can talk across any distance, and where we're free to love who we want, the medieval era seems like a dark and difficult time for romance. Yet the bravery of those who pursued love despite the odds adds a certain beauty and poignancy to their stories. As I dive into part 5 of the medieval dating narrative, the focus is on the harsh realities of courtship and marriage during that period. Love had a hard time surviving in such a brutal environment, but courtship itself was fraught with risks that we can hardly imagine today. Back then, trying to win someone's affection was a dangerous game. Marriages were arranged more like business deals or military alliances, turning courtship into a high-stakes competition. Young men looking for love had to do more than just woo the woman they desired. They had to navigate a complex web of family politics where a wrong move could lead to violence or even death. A simple romantic gesture gone wrong, or stepping out of line without the family's approval, could ignite feuds that lasted for generations. Take the story of Thomas Dash, a knight's son in 14th century England. He fell hard for Margaret, a girl from a rival family. Their love story might sound sweet, with secret meetings and exchanged love tokens, but it ended in tragedy. When Margaret's father found out, he saw red. To him, his daughter's love wasn't hers to give away. It was a bargaining chip in the world of political marriages. Thomas's love for Margaret was seen as a theft of valuable property. The situation escalated to the point where Margaret's father challenged Thomas to a duel. The confrontation was deadly, leaving both men dying. This story shows just how perilous medieval love could be. Pursuing your heart's desire wasn't just about romance. It could be a matter of life and death. Back in the day, love was pretty much a luxury people couldn't afford. Folks fell for each other, sure, but when it came down to marriage, it was all about the practical stuff. Like Margaret, who was really into someone, ended up married to a guy 3 times her age because that's just how things were done. No one really cared what she wanted. It was all about the bigger picture, like morning mist that disappears with the first light. It was a tough time to be young and in love because you pretty much learned early on that your feelings didn't matter. When it came to finding someone to marry, it wasn't about love, but more like a business deal. Parents weren't looking for someone their kid loved. They were looking at dowries and family connections. And even if by some miracle the families were cool with the match, getting through the whole courtship process was like navigating a minefield because of all the weird and risky traditions. One of these was bundling, which sounds bizarre now, but was taken very seriously back then. In colder places, a dating couple would share a bed fully clothed, sometimes with a board between them, to get to know each other better without doing anything physical. But as you can imagine, this led to a bunch of scandals, unplanned pregnancies, and marriages that started off on the wrong foot. Obsessing over virginity was another headache. Women were constantly watched to make sure they didn't do anything deemed inappropriate. Just talking to a guy could wreck a woman's reputation, and if anything did happen, the consequences could be dire, like being shamed, sent away, or worse. The pressure was so high that some women took extreme and dangerous steps to seem like virgins on their wedding nights, which could end very badly. Guys had their own set of challenges. They had to show they were worthy through acts of bravery that often left them hurt or even killed. Tournaments, which were supposed to be about chivalry, were actually brutal and dangerous. So looking back, the whole idea of medieval romance was pretty complicated and far from the fairy tales we think of today. Back in the day, the whole idea of knights in shining armor going on quests for their true loves wasn't just a fairy tale. It was pretty grim. These young guys often ended up dead, trying to win someone's heart. This whole notion of chasing adventures for love was actually built on a lot of real-life tragedies. On top of that, getting married for love back then was seen as a bad move. It was thought to mess with family wealth and throw the social order out of whack. If a peasant decided to marry for love, he could end up getting kicked out and left to starve with his partner. And if someone from the nobility went against their family's wishes, they could lose everything, lands, title, you name it, overnight. The church, which was supposed to look out for marriage, sometimes made things even trickier. There were so many rules about who you could marry. Sometimes couples found out way too late that they were too closely related to get married. Getting permission to marry anyway was a hassle and super expensive, so only the rich had a shot at it. Religious festivals, which should have been fun, turned into times when women had to watch out. There were guys out there looking to take advantage of the more relaxed vibe, so many families kept their daughters locked up tight to avoid any trouble. Even when a couple managed to get through all that and actually get married, they weren't out of the woods. Life back then was tough. Disease, childbirth, violence, you name it, it could all lead to one of them dying pretty soon after tying the knot. So wedding celebrations were kind of bittersweet, with everyone knowing they might not have much time together. And the wedding night, which was supposed to be this big romantic thing, was often anything but, especially for the bride. It was a rough time all around, with love and marriage being anything but the fairy tale we think of today. In a time when young brides often didn't know what was coming, getting married almost always meant getting pregnant soon after. And with that, there was a high chance of dying. For a lot of women back then, saying "I do" was like accepting a death sentence, but with flowers and music. If they made it past the first few years, there wasn't much of a break waiting for them. It was a time when it was okay for husbands to hit their wives if they thought they needed to be disciplined. The scary part was, it was up to the husband to decide what counted as discipline. If a woman complained too much, she could be accused of being a witch or cheating, which could get her killed. Being isolated in their homes, women had nowhere to go if they were being abused. Sometimes, even their own families would choose to keep up appearances rather than help them. The church wasn't much help either, telling women to just put up with it and that they'd get their reward in the afterlife. Kids growing up in these environments learned early on that relationships weren't about love or friendship, but about power and just getting by. This sad view of marriage and love kept going, generation after generation, making it really hard for anyone to find true closeness with another person. But even in these tough times, there were people who found real love. Unfortunately, they often ended up being pulled apart by things like wars, sickness, or family disagreements. These stories of love lost became legends, like Romeo and Juliet, because so many people could relate to losing someone they loved because of things out of their control. The stories from back then are full of tales about lovers who would rather die than be apart, showing just how much people longed for a love that many never got to live out. In medieval romance stories, there's a deep longing for connection that shines through, despite the harsh realities of the time. These tales hint at how tough dating was back then, a real-life horror show. It was risky business, with people's hearts and lives on the line, in a society that didn't do much to protect the vulnerable or care for love's demands. When we moan about how complicated dating is today, it might be worth thinking about our ancestors. They weren't just risking heartbreak, but actual physical harm, exile, and even death in their search for love. Now let's dive deeper into the darker side of medieval romance. Beyond the strict marriage rules and harsh customs, there was something even more sinister. The mix of superstitions, religious frenzy, and belief in the paranormal made falling in love downright dangerous. Picture a young woman named Isabel in a medieval cottage, braiding herbs into her hair and muttering old spells, not to conjure dark magic, but to catch the eye of Thomas, the blacksmith's son. These were old folk remedies meant to attract love, but in those times, the line between medicine and magic was thin. Such innocent acts could easily be seen as witchcraft. The medieval world was drenched in supernatural beliefs that deeply affected romantic relationships. Love was often seen with suspicion and fear. A sudden, passionate love might be blamed on potions, spells, or demons, not just attraction. Especially women could quickly find themselves accused of witchcraft for their actions in love, showing just how complicated and dangerous pursuing romance was in those times. Back in the day, if you were a woman who stood out because you were really smart, really beautiful, or just liked doing your own thing, you might get labeled a witch or a sorceress. The church was pretty strict about things like sex and romance, making everyone scared of their own desires. They taught that lust was a big no-no, one of the 7 deadly sins. So, if you felt really strongly about someone, it could be seen as you being under a demon's influence or just being plain corrupt. This idea turned the natural feelings that bring people together into something scary and spiritually risky. Young folks were taught to doubt and fear their own feelings, which made starting any kind of romantic relationship really stressful. Take Edmund, a guy from 14th century England, for example. When he fell for a merchant's daughter, he didn't jump for joy. Instead, he was freaked out, worrying his feelings were a sin, a temptation from Satan, or maybe the girl was using witchcraft on him. This kind of mental anguish was normal, turning what's supposed to be a happy romantic discovery into a mix of guilt, fear, and a full-blown spiritual meltdown. Belief in love magic was everywhere, and it wasn't seen as a good thing. People thought certain folks, especially older women who knew a lot about herbs and folk remedies, could whip up potions and spells to mess with someone's feelings. While some of these beliefs led to harmless traditions, they also made it easy for women to get accused of witchcraft for pretty much anything. If a woman was good with herbs, lived by herself, or was just not liked by her neighbors, she might find herself on trial for using her powers to control men. The witch trials that hit Europe from the 15th to the 17th century were brutal for romantic relationships. Women had to be super careful about what they did or said, living in fear that any little thing could get them accused of witchcraft. Back in the day, people thought that some folks had supernatural powers just by the way they looked. This kind of thinking made everyone suspicious and scared, especially when it came to men and women getting along. Guys were told to be careful around women who were really pretty, super smart, or didn't need a man, because these traits might mean they were involved with some spooky stuff. The law wasn't much help either. If you were accused of using love magic or being a witch, good luck. You had to prove you were innocent instead of the other way around. They'd even torture people to get a confession, and the ways they figured out if someone was a witch were totally bonkers. Like, you could be sentenced to die if a guy said you made him fall in love with you using magic, or if someone thought you stole another woman's husband by casting spells. Take the story of Agnes Waterhouse, for example. She was one of the first women in England to be executed for witchcraft in 1566. Agnes was an older lady who lived by herself and knew a lot about herbs. When a few young guys in her village couldn't make their love lives work, rumors started that Agnes was messing with them using magic. Before you know it, she was on trial and got executed, even though there was no real proof. This whole fear of magic messed with every part of dating and getting married back then. Weddings had all these rituals and things to do to keep evil spirits and bad magic away. Brides would wear certain colors, carry special herbs, or do specific things to protect themselves. Even the wedding night was full of superstitions and rituals because people thought it was a time when bad vibes could really do some damage to the new marriage. Back in the day, even giving your sweetheart a simple gift like a ring, a lock of hair, or a pressed flower was a big deal because people thought it could be some kind of magical spell. If you were young and in love, you had to be super careful about what you traded with your crush. What seemed like a cute token of love could later be twisted into proof of witchcraft, especially if the romance went downhill or if someone had it out for you. Adding to the drama was the fear of the evil eye. People truly believed that certain folks could jinx you just by giving you a nasty look. So if you were dealing with a jealous ex, a suitor you turned down, or even family who didn't like your partner, any bad luck in love could be blamed on this so-called curse. Whether it was a rough patch with your partner, a miscarriage, or an illness, folks would rather pin it on the evil eye than think there might be a logical explanation. Then there was the whole nightmare of demonic possession. Say a young woman didn't want to go through with an arranged marriage or was really into someone her family didn't approve of. She might be accused of being possessed by demons. The so-called cures for this were horrifying. Think exorcisms, beatings, starving, and other tortures, all in the name of getting rid of the evil spirits. Religious leaders were all about spreading these scary ideas. They figured that if people were afraid of their feelings and constantly worried about supernatural stuff messing with their love life, it would be easier to keep everyone in line. The church had a tight grip on dating and marriage, telling young folks to ignore their hearts and watch out for signs of otherworldly interference. This way, they had a lot of power over who got together with whom. On top of all this, there was a dangerous mix of medicine and magic. If someone turned to these so-called remedies for help with their love life or other issues, they were stepping into risky territory. People who helped with love problems, like herbalists, midwives, and folk healers, often got accused of witchcraft. Even doctors and educated folks could be suspected if they had too much success or got mixed up in romantic drama. Imagine growing up scared that falling in love could get you in trouble, thinking that showing love or having a relationship might mean you're messed up by some evil magic. This fear made it super hard for people to truly connect and trust each other. Court records from way back show how terrible the impact of these beliefs was. Loads of women got tortured and killed because people thought they used love magic or did something witchy related to romance. Families got ripped apart, and whole communities ended up filled with fear and doubt. What's crazy is that a lot of what got slammed as supernatural was just smart use of plants, understanding people, and giving solid advice. Women who knew this stuff often got accused of being witches, which was really an attack on women knowing things and being independent. Also, blaming supernatural stuff was a handy out for guys not wanting to own up to their romantic decisions. A guy could just say he was bewitched to get out of trouble for leaving his wife or messing up a commitment. In the past, people often accused others of being under supernatural influence to escape the consequences of their actions. This was especially harmful to women, who were frequently blamed and had their lives ruined because of these claims. Even royal marriages weren't safe from these fears, with kings and queens going to great lengths to protect their relationships from curses and political enemies, using magic against them. This paranoia was everywhere, from hiring specialists to fight off curses to worrying about supernatural interference in marriages or fertility. The culture back then, including art and literature, was full of stories about magical seduction, enchantresses, and love potions. These tales were not just for entertainment. They also promoted the idea that love was dangerous and possibly magical. As a result, young people grew up fearing and suspecting their own love stories, always wondering if there was some supernatural force at play. The legal system of medieval Europe took these supernatural threats very seriously. 2. There were detailed laws against love magic, and the punishments could be brutal, ranging from fines and humiliation to torture and even death. The existence and enforcement of these laws showed just how real these fears were to people at the time. The fear of supernatural interference in romance wasn't just a cultural issue, it had real economic consequences as well. Families would often spend a lot of money on protective charms or spells to safeguard their children's love lives. This widespread fear could also mess up trade, political alliances, and social relationships as people became wary of others, suspecting them of having supernatural motives behind their romantic advice or actions. Overall, the belief in and fear of supernatural influences in romance had a profound impact on society, from the highest levels of royalty to everyday relationships, shaping laws, economies, and personal lives across medieval Europe. The belief in the supernatural's influence on romantic relationships was a widespread phenomenon across Europe and even further. While the specifics varied from place to place, the fear of the supernatural meddling in love was almost everywhere. It's clear these beliefs played a big role in society and in people's minds, but at a high cost, causing a lot of pain and unfairness. Looking back at this bleak part of relationship history, it's shocking to see how ignorance, fear, and the need for control turned love, one of our most basic feelings, into something terrifying. During the medieval times, the way society viewed love and romance through a supernatural lens was probably the most extreme example of turning something as natural as wanting connection into a life-threatening issue. The impact of these beliefs didn't just stop when the medieval era ended. They left a mark that lasted for centuries, shaping views on women, sexuality, and romantic relationships. The witch trials, the targeting of women healers and midwives, and the general mistrust of women's independence all stem from the fears of the medieval times regarding romance and sexuality. By exploring these old views on love, we not only learn about the past, but also see how easily fear and misunderstanding can lead to viewing even the most wonderful parts of being human as something to be scared of. The story of Isabel, a young woman we talked about earlier, illustrates this perfectly. She lived in a time when just trying to find love could be seen as witchcraft. In such a world, falling in love wasn't just a personal gamble, but could literally mean risking your life. This shows just how twisted and dangerous things can get when ignorance and fear take over, turning love into a source of fear and persecution. It's pretty sad how in medieval times, the very things that make us feel the most human were seen as signs of being corrupt. I'm diving into part 7 of this series about why dating back then was pretty much a nightmare. One of the harshest realities for lovers in those days was how often death seemed to just be waiting around the corner. Since people didn't usually live past 30, finding someone to love was like racing against time. Women, in particular, had it tough. If a woman caught a man's attention and got pregnant, she faced the very real risk of dying in childbirth. More women died giving birth than men did on battlefields. The lack of medical knowledge and clean birthing practices pretty much meant that having a baby was super dangerous. Take the story of Marguerite de Montlaire, for example. It's a story from 13th century France that really shows how tragic love could be back then. By the time she was 17, which was considered old for marriage, she hadn't been married off yet. When she did fall in love with a young knight named Guillaume, it seemed like luck was on their side. They wrote secret love letters, met secretly, and dreamed of a future that wasn't just about politics and noble marriages. But when Marguerite got pregnant, what should have been happy news turned into a nightmare. Childbirth was brutal back then. Midwives, relying more on superstition than actual medical knowledge, would do things like hang stones around the mother's neck or put a knife under the bed to try to ease labor pains. And if there were any complications, their methods of dealing with them often made things worse. So, Marguerite's story is a stark reminder of how dangerous love could be in medieval times. For 3 long and painful days, Guillaume was pacing back and forth outside her door, feeling helpless. The midwives inside were doing everything they knew how, like burning herbs and saying prayers, but none of it was working. When she died, which was probably because of something like sepsis or severe bleeding, Guillaume was devastated, but the tragedy didn't stop there. His wife's family, in their sadness and anger, blamed him. They said he had cursed their daughter with his love, leading her into sin, and that's why she was taken so young. This sad story wasn't something that just happened to Guam and his wife. It was a common situation for many couples back in the Middle Ages. Even if you were lucky enough to find love among all the social rules, religious limits, and family drama, there was always the huge risk that illness or death would tear you apart way too soon. Diseases were everywhere, hitting people left and right. The Black Death was the worst of it, wiping out about a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. So many people were left alone, mourning spouses they hadn't had nearly enough time with. Because death was so common, love back then felt more intense. People didn't have the time to take things slow or wait for feelings to grow. You never knew if you were going to get hit by a plague, hurt badly, or die in childbirth. Every moment together felt precious. That's why a lot of the love poems and songs from those times seem really passionate and kind of sad to us now. Even those famous tunes about love that wasn't returned were probably inspired by how often people actually lost their loves to death. But there was another scary thing about falling in love back then. The church taught that being really in love could mess up your relationship with God. They thought of it as a kind of sickness of the soul that could lead you off the right path. So, not only did lovers have to worry about losing each other to death, but they also had to deal with the fear that their feelings could be dangerous to their spiritual health. It was a tough time to be in love. Back in the day, young folks naturally craved closeness and love, but they were stuck in a tough spot. They were told that the very emotions that made them feel alive were the ones that could doom them forever. The whole idea of being in love, something we think of as good and pure, was pretty much alien to people in medieval times. So, when stories about courtly love started popping up in the 12th century, talking about romance and putting your loved one on a pedestal, it was a big deal. It was so out there that loving a woman as much as people worshipped the Virgin Mary was seen as shocking. What's more, the thought that wanting someone could actually make you a better person went against everything medieval Christianity stood for. But even with its high ideals, this kind of love was full of risks. Most of the time, it was about wanting someone you couldn't or shouldn't have, like falling for your boss's spouse, which obviously led to a lot of heartache and drama. The stories from back then, like the ones about knights and their impossible loves, weren't about finding a way to make it work. They were about the beauty of suffering from love that couldn't go anywhere. Falling in love wasn't just emotionally risky either. According to doctors back then, getting hit by the love bug could literally make you sick. They called it love sickness, and it could mess you up, causing everything from insomnia to what we'd now call severe depression. And the cures they had, like bleeding you out or making you throw up, could be just as bad as the sickness. One of the most famous love stories from those times is about Abelard and Heloise. Their story pretty much has it all, showing just how complicated and dangerous love could be back then. Abelard and Heloise's love affair started off as a simple teacher-student relationship. Abelard, a brilliant philosopher, was hired to tutor Heloise, who was just as smart. Their shared love for knowledge quickly turned into a romantic connection, leading to a secret marriage and a child. However, when Heloise's uncle found out, he had Abelard brutally castrated as punishment. This forced the lovers to part ways, with Heloise entering a convent and Abelard becoming a monk. They spent the rest of their lives writing heart-wrenching letters to each other, expressing a love that was never fully realized. Their story became famous, not because it had a happy ending, but precisely because it didn't. In medieval times, true love was expected to end in suffering. The notion that lovers might live happily ever after was seen as unrealistic and even belittling to the concept of love. Young people going into romantic relationships knew well that heartbreak wasn't just a possibility, but very likely. The violence that often surrounded medieval romance wasn't just about dramatic acts by jealous family members. Even consensual relationships were fraught with danger, something hard for us to understand today. Just meeting in secret could lead to accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or heresy. any of which could result in torture and execution. Women who were too independent in love could be labeled as wanton or possessed, while men could be accused of seduction, rape, or corrupting innocence. The legal system back then didn't offer much protection if you were seen as going against social norms. Women, in particular, had almost no rights when it came to marriage and sexuality. They could be forced into marriage, divorced on a whim, or accused of adultery based on very little evidence. In medieval times, men faced real dangers if they fell in love with someone from a higher social class or messed with the marriage plans of powerful families. People back then lived in one-room houses with their whole family and even animals, so getting some privacy was nearly impossible. If a couple wanted to have a private conversation, they had to do it under the watchful eyes of practically everyone they knew. This is why the idea of sneaking around and having secret meetings became a thing. It was pretty much the only way to have a moment alone. The way the economy was set up back then also made love complicated. Marriages were more about money, politics, and keeping the family line going than about love. Even for the less wealthy, practical stuff like merging assets and setting up a home often mattered more than romantic feelings. Falling for the wrong person could lead to disaster, not just emotionally, but financially too. A woman might be cut off from her family and left with nothing if she picked love over a good marriage deal. A man in love with a woman from a higher class could end up being rejected and even hit back financially by her family. Life back then was also shaped by the seasons, especially for people in farming. There wasn't much time for relaxing or dating during the main farming seasons. Young folks usually had to wait for religious festivals or market days to meet up, which didn't leave much room for romance. Back in the day, people in love had to make do with brief moments together, which had to be enough to keep their relationships going through long stretches of time apart and a lot of hard work. One of the biggest challenges to keeping the spark alive was the state of hygiene and medical care during medieval times. Imagine trying to stay romantically involved when you're dealing with dental issues, skin diseases, or infections, and there's no real treatment for any of it. The idea of beauty back then was always clashing with the reality that people aged quickly and were often dealing with health problems that we'd easily treat today. But believe it or not, love still managed to thrive. There's something really powerful about the fact that, even with all these challenges, people continued to write love stories, sing love songs, and fall for each other. It's like a big middle finger to the circumstances and dangers they were up against. Those medieval romantics, going after love despite everything, were probably braver than any knight we hear about. They weren't just fighting against a person, they were up against their whole society and what it meant to be human back then. The part of medieval romance that probably freaked people out the most was the widespread belief that falling in love could be the result of black magic. Picture a world where every shadow might be hiding something supernatural, where the idea of getting hit by Cupid's arrow was more about evil spells than cute metaphors. People were genuinely scared that witches or devils were messing with them, making them fall in love through spells and potions. The whole concept of love was surrounded by suspicion and fear because, in their minds, enchantment was a part of everyday life. In the old days, when a nobleman fell hard for a serving girl or a merchant's wife ran off with a minstrel, people were quick to blame witchcraft. They thought love potions, magic amulets, and deals with demons were stirring up these passions, not just regular old love. Women often got the worst of it. If a woman was unusually pretty, knew a thing or two about healing, or just happened to catch someone's eye a bit too much, she could be accused of being a witch. Being smart, independent, or good with herbs or animals could actually make things worse, because back then, these were seen as signs of having some dark powers. Take Marguerite de Poré, for example. She was a French mystic and writer in the late 13th century who wrote about her deep spiritual love for God. Her writings were so intense and heartfelt that the church leaders got all worked up, thinking she was stepping out of line. They didn't see her as a heretic in the usual sense, but were scared of a woman talking so freely and passionately about love, even if it was about God. The Inquisition demanded she take back her words and fall in line with what the male church authorities wanted. But Marguerite wouldn't back down or agree that her views on divine love were wrong or evil. Because of her refusal, she was executed in Paris in 1310, and they tried to destroy all her writings. Luckily, some of her books were saved by people who saw the truth and beauty in her words, not the so-called witchcraft her accusers were ranting about. But Marguerite wasn't the only one. Throughout medieval Europe, women who talked openly about love, practiced healing, or simply lived life on their own terms often faced accusations of witchcraft. Just the mere fact of being desirable to men could be twisted into proof of using dark powers to manipulate them. When a man left his wife for another woman back in the day, people didn't blame him. Instead, they pointed fingers at the woman he ran off with, calling her a sorceress who trapped him with her dark magic. This fear of love spells was everywhere, from the top of society to the bottom. Rich families would get priests to bless their marriages to keep enchantments away. Merchants traveling to far-off places carried charms to protect themselves from being bewitched by exotic strangers. Even regular folks would pray over their kids' beds, hoping to shield them from the evil eye or a curse that could doom them to a lonely life or wild, destructive love. This whole vibe made everyone super suspicious of real love. People wondered if a crush was just that, or if it was some magic potion at work. Was a woman's beauty natural, or did she strike a deal with the devil? These kinds of questions really messed with people's heads, turning what should have been happy feelings into fear and doubt. The church didn't help matters either. They were all about pushing the idea that too much passion was a bad thing, probably the work of demons. Priests would tell folks that beautiful women were just traps set by Satan to lure good men to their doom, and that lust was the devil's favorite way to snag souls. Any love that seemed too intense or went against the norms was looked at with a lot of suspicion. Even the medical world got in on this, influenced by ancient texts and church teachings. They thought being in love was basically a mental illness that could mess you up big time, leading to bad decisions and even ruining your relationship with God. Doctors back then would suggest things like bloodletting, fasting, and praying to cure someone of amor hero, what they called the sickness of too much love. The symptoms they listed out, like not being able to sleep, not eating, and obsessing over someone, were legit, but they thought it was all because of demons or something, not understanding the real reasons behind those feelings. So, in a nutshell, thinking about love back then was pretty complicated. People were constantly on edge, wondering if their feelings were genuine or just some spell. And with everyone from the church to doctors saying love could be a sign of something sinister, it's no wonder romance was such a tricky business. Back in the day, if a woman showed too much interest in love or seemed to really enjoy getting close to someone, people would say she was either under a demon's spell or practicing witchcraft. The cure for this could be pretty harsh, including things like exorcism, public shaming, or even being accused of heresy, which could get someone killed. This fear around love magic also led to a kind of black market. People called wise women, despite the danger to themselves, would sell charms and potions to keep away unwanted lovers or to break supposed spells. Priests would offer special services to help those who thought they were bewitched by love. But here's the ironic part. The very people folks turned to for help against love magic might later be accused of using it themselves. Growing up in this environment was tough for young people. They were taught to be scared of their own feelings. Normal sexual development was seen as something bad, a sort of spiritual battle. Parents and religious leaders were always on the lookout for any hint that their kids were under some evil influence. Instead of celebrating the start of romantic feelings as a natural part of growing up, it was something to be ashamed and scared of. The legal system was all in on this too. Courts would regularly see cases about love magic, and often all the proof they needed was someone saying that a person fell in love in a way that wasn't approved. The bar for evidence was incredibly low. If a man left his family for another woman, if a young person didn't want to marry who their parents chose for them, or if someone just seemed too passionate that could be enough to accuse them of witchcraft. The punishments for those found guilty were brutal. Women accused of using magic to spark love faced public shaming, torture, and often death, while their supposed victims were seen as just that, victims. Men who cheated or felt inappropriate desires often got off scot-free, blamed on being bewitched by forces they couldn't control. This loophole let guys dodge the blame for their romantic decisions, pointing fingers at others for the chaos their love lives caused in society's neat plans. A nobleman could just ditch his arranged marriage for someone he preferred more, claiming he was under a spell. This way, he saved face and sidestepped any fallout from breaking his promises. For women, the consequences were harsh. If you were pretty, smart, or had a mind of your own, you were always at risk of being called a witch. Many tried to look less appealing, downplay their smarts, or hide their true selves just to stay off the radar. Some found safety in becoming nuns, where rejecting romantic advances was seen as saintly, not suspicious. But the saddest part was how these beliefs ruined love itself. In a society where deep affection was seen as a sign of witchcraft and a strong pull towards someone was thought to be the devil's doing, real love became a minefield. Couples could have been happy together, but instead, they were scared. Scared that their feelings were either a sin or fake, trickery from some dark spell. This mindset caused a lot of psychological harm. People began to doubt their feelings, seeing their deepest emotions as possibly evil or not real. Love, which should have been joyful and comforting, was now overshadowed by fear that it might all be the work of dark forces. Connections that should have been about spiritual growth and trust turned into minefields of spiritual danger and social suspicion. Even when relationships were successful, there was this shadow of fear over them. Couples who truly cared for each other found themselves having to constantly prove that their love was pure and godly, not the result of some enchantment. They had to show they were in control and that their love was for the greater good of God and society, not just driven by selfish desires. Enjoying the company of one's spouse too much could even make people suspicious that the relationship was supernaturally influenced. This fear created a culture where being true to your feelings was not just discouraged, it was seen as dangerous. People learned to just go through the motions, showing the kind of affection that was approved while hiding their real emotions. This led to relationships that were built on a foundation of fear and pretense, rather than real connection. The essence of romantic love, which is the honest expression of attraction and care, was practically destroyed by the constant fear of being accused of supernatural involvement. Children who grew up in this kind of environment took these fears and suspicions with them into adulthood, perpetuating a cycle where love was always seen through a lens of spiritual warfare. Instead of learning about love through positive guidance on healthy relationships, young people were taught to see love as something dangerous, filled with demonic risks, and the need to be always on guard against supernatural seduction. As we look more into how medieval society approached courtship and marriage, we see how these fears of the supernatural influenced every part of romantic life. It created a system where being watched and controlled was normal, making true love not just hard to find, but actually dangerous. The next part of our exploration will show how these beliefs affected the practical side of medieval courtship. Young people looking for love had to navigate not just social hurdles, but also the real threats of being accused, persecuted, and even facing death. In this world, love was under suspicion, passion was seen as proof of corruption, and women who inspired desire were in a particularly precarious position. Accusations of witchcraft turned the simple human need for connection and affection into a dangerous journey filled with supernatural terrors and social condemnation. This system favored power and control more than it did the human heart, creating a medieval romance that was more like a nightmare filled with fear, and that suspicion and tragic loss. The grip of superstition on medieval romance cast an even darker shadow over it than the physical and social constraints we've already talked about. In a world where the natural and supernatural were dangerously blurred, love became something to be suspicious of. It was seen through a lens of fear that turned tender feelings into potential evidence of demonic interference or witchcraft. Medieval society was constantly scared of unseen forces. Every unexplained event, sudden illness, or stroke of misfortune was blamed on evil supernatural forces. This paranoia was especially destructive when it came to matters of the heart. Love, with its mysterious power to change behavior and inspire seemingly irrational actions, seemed like a supernatural force to people back then. Take the story of Elénine, a young merchant's daughter in 14th century France. When she showed signs of being in love, like daydreaming, losing her appetite, and whispering passionately about the blacksmith's apprentice, her family didn't see it as young love. They thought she showed signs of demonic possession or enchantment. Her father immediately called for a priest, convinced she was under a spell. This wasn't just a one-off. Medieval medical texts even described love as a form of mental illness called love sickness or erotic melancholy, with symptoms that we now recognize as normal behaviors when someone is in love. In medieval times, people saw romantic attraction in a much darker light than we do today. Constantine the African, a well-known doctor back then, talked about love as if it was a dangerous sickness. According to him, it could lead to madness, violence, or even death. If someone showed signs of being in love, the typical reaction wasn't support or understanding. Instead, people were scared and often turned to supernatural methods to deal with it. The church, in particular, played a big role in making people scared of love. Religious leaders told everyone that romantic love was a step away from what Christians should focus on. They said that strong feelings of love could make someone an easy target for the devil, tempting them into sin. Young people were taught to be wary of their feelings, seeing romantic desire as something that could be sinful or even evil. This kind of fear made it really scary to express any romantic feelings. For example, a young guy writing love poems could be accused of messing with dark magic. A woman who seemed too into a guy could be suspected of being a witch. In the eyes of people back then, the intensity of love was proof of some kind of evil influence. Everyone, from the rich nobles to the common peasants, was worried about love magic. Nobles would have someone taste their food, not just to check for poison, but to make sure there weren't any love potions that could mess up their plans for marriage. Merchants watched their daughters closely, scared that competitors might use magic to influence romantic feelings for their own gain. Peasants feared that their rivals would go to wise men or cunning women to cast spells to steal their loved ones' hearts. These fears had some basis in the reality of those times. There was a whole underground market for love magic, with people known as cunning folk, hedge witches, and folk healers. They sold potions, charms, and spells meant to start, boost, or end romantic feelings. Back in medieval times, people who practiced love magic were often just herbalists using natural aphrodisiacs or playing with the mind. But society back then really thought they had some kind of magic powers. This belief caused a lot of problems for regular folks trying to figure out their love lives. Young couples had to keep their feelings a secret and were scared that their love could be seen as something evil. Margaret of Wessex's story from the 15th century tells us a lot about what this was like. She was a wool merchant's daughter who wrote about her love for a guy named Thomas in her diary. But she was always scared that her feelings were caused by a curse or something evil. She even prayed for God to get rid of what she thought might be a demonic influence on her. When Thomas liked her back, she believed she had somehow dragged him down with her. This fear was like a never-ending loop. The more someone fell in love, the more they thought it was because of bad magic. This led to a lot of guilt, self-hate, and trying to deny their feelings. People were basically taught to see their own emotions as something bad that could be proof of being spiritually corrupt. The fear about love being related to witchcraft was also a handy tool for people who wanted to mess up someone's love life. If someone was jealous, didn't want a certain couple to be together, or wanted revenge, they could just start rumors that someone was using love magic. These kinds of accusations were serious and could lead to the accused being put on trial and often tortured to get them to confess. Back in the day, the methods used to figure out if someone was using love magic were pretty harsh and could even lead to death. Women who were accused might be tied up and thrown into water to see if they would float. because it was believed that witches could float while innocent ones would sink. They could also go through pricking tests, where people looked all over their bodies for any unusual marks that they thought proved guilt. Even if no one officially accused them, just the fear of love magic made everyone super suspicious and paranoid. Couples had to be really careful about showing their love for each other, scared that showing too much passion might make others think they were using magic. They were always worried that someone who was rejected or jealous might start rumors that could ruin not just their relationship, but their reputations and even their lives. The records from medieval witch trials showed just how much these fears messed up people's love lives. Over and over, you see love stories falling apart because of accusations of magic. Young women could be executed for being too attractive or too good at winning hearts. Men could be accused of using magic to attract women who were out of their league. The trial of Agnes Waterhouse in 1566 is a perfect example. She was executed for witchcraft because she was accused of using magic to make men fall in love with her, break up relationships, and even cause impotence in men who didn't return her feelings. The main evidence against her was just that she seemed unusually successful in love, and several men were really into her. In a society where women weren't supposed to be too forward or in control of their romantic lives, Agnes's ability to attract and influence men was seen as proof she had supernatural powers. This really shows how back then, the fear of love magic was especially tough on women, making them targets for suspicion just for being charming or good at navigating romance. In the medieval times, women were often thought to be more vulnerable to demons and more likely to use magic to get what they wanted. If a woman was especially beautiful, charming, or had a lot of romantic success, people would get suspicious. The idea of a woman having control over her love life was so scary to the men in charge back then that they made it seem like something evil. This fear was so strong that it led to some pretty bad situations for women who were naturally attractive or had a way with people. Being pretty or charming started to be seen as a sign that a woman might be using magic, so women felt they had to hide how they looked and act less friendly, afraid that being too lucky in love could get them accused of being witches. This fear wasn't just bad for women, it messed up whole communities. People in villages would always be on edge, thinking that some of the women living with them were secretly using magic to mess with love lives. If anything weird happened, like someone falling in love out of the blue, getting married quickly, or breaking off an engagement, it could start rumors and lead to investigations. Imagine how stressful it was to live like that, always worrying that showing your feelings could get you in trouble. Young people grew up thinking they couldn't trust their own feelings, seeing romantic love as something scary and maybe even evil. They learned to be scared of real closeness because they were taught that love might be a sign of being under a spell. These fears also put people in a tough spot when they actually fell in love. They had to choose between following their heart and staying safe from accusations of using magic. A lot of them chose to stay safe, hiding their true feelings and getting into marriages without love because that's what society expected. But some took the risk for love, even though it meant their love could be seen as something bad. The records of trials about love magic from the medieval times show just how deep these fears went. In a society obsessed with controlling and suppressing romantic feelings, people accused of using love magic were put through intense interrogations. They had to explain where they learned their magical skills, name their supposed demonic partners, and admit to manipulating others romantically. The torture methods were brutal, aiming to force confessions that would back up the accuser's superstitious beliefs. Women, in particular, faced sleep deprivation, physical torture, and psychological manipulation until they would say anything the interrogators wanted to hear. These coerced confessions were then used as proof that love magic was a real and widespread threat. This led to a vicious cycle where each confession reinforced the society's fears, justifying more investigations, torture, and even executions. The records of these trials spread far and wide, fueling paranoia and serving as a guide for future accusations. The fear around love magic hit its peak during the great witch hunts from the 15th, 17th centuries. In this time, thousands, mostly women, were executed for alleged magic practices, with a good number accused of love magic. The Malus Maleficarum, a witch hunter's manual published in 1487, had a lot of content on how to spot and prosecute those accused of love magic. This persecution made romantic love a dangerous affair. Young people were terrified that showing love too openly or being too good at attracting partners could get them labeled as witches. They lived in fear that their natural feelings might be seen as signs of dealing with the supernatural. On top of all this fear and terror, there was also an economic aspect. The superstitions around love magic didn't just affect personal relationships. They had wider impacts, adding another layer of control and suppression in society. In medieval times, accusations of love magic added a horrifying twist to romance stories. These accusations became a way to wage economic warfare. Successful merchants could see their daughters accused of using magic to snag wealthy husbands. Prosperous widows who remarried were sometimes claimed to have bewitched their new spouses. Even peasant women who married up faced risks of being accused of using magic to win over their husbands. The underlying motive for these accusations was often economic, targeting those who seemed to have stepped beyond their expected social or financial status thanks to their romantic endeavors. The people most vulnerable to these accusations were typically the poor women who, against the odds, found romantic success. Their lack of resources to defend themselves legally or socially made them easy targets. These accusations could lead to them losing their property, being exiled, or even facing death. This whole situation also highlights the deep fear of female sexuality that existed in medieval society. Women who showed any sexual independence or made the first romantic move were immediately under suspicion. They were often thought to be using magic to subvert the male dominance that was considered the norm. This fear led to the creation of tests and procedures to figure out if a relationship was influenced by magic. Church authorities would interrogate people, looking for signs like a sudden, intense passion or a relationship that seemed too good to be true based on social status or physical appearance. The fear of love magic poisoned relationships within communities. Neighbors, friends, and family members became wary of each other's romantic successes, always on the lookout for possible supernatural interference. Social gatherings turned into opportunities to watch and judge, as everyone was suspicious that others might be using magic to achieve their romantic goals. In medieval times, being accused of practicing magic wasn't just a legal problem. It meant you could lose all your friends and family as they were too scared to be associated with you. Even if you didn't end up in court, the rumors alone could ruin your life, leaving you completely isolated. Adding to the misery was how these superstitions messed with people's heads about love. Imagine being taught that your crush might be a sin, or worse, a sign that the devil's got a hold on you. People were scared to even admit to themselves they had feelings for someone else, worried it was some demonic trick. Doctors back then didn't help matters. They actually backed up these crazy ideas, saying love was a kind of madness sent by supernatural forces. They came up with all these theories about demons messing with people's emotions and even recommended exorcisms as treatment. So when a respected doctor said your love sickness was due to demons, people were more likely to believe that maybe their neighbor was casting love spells. The courts really took it to the next level, though. They had this whole system set up to deal with love magic, with official procedures for everything from the initial accusation to interrogating suspects. It was a well-oiled machine designed to tear apart relationships based on nothing but fear and superstition. Back in the day, the way people figured out if someone was guilty or innocent made it look like there was a legal reason for what was really just picking on people for superstitious reasons. The records from these legal cases show that there was a clear method to the madness. People accused of messing with love through magic went through a pretty standard investigation process, and the punishments were designed to scare everyone else straight. This wasn't just random bullying, it was an organized effort to scare people away from romantic feelings. What made this whole situation even scarier was that you couldn't just move away and expect things to be different elsewhere. The fear of so-called love magic was everywhere in medieval Europe, creating an atmosphere where everyone was suspicious of each other. It didn't matter if you were just trading or going on a pilgrimage, these superstitious beliefs followed you. So, imagine trying to run away with your loved one to avoid gossip, only to land in a new place where people were just as paranoid. In this kind of environment, love, which is supposed to be this beautiful thing, turned into a source of fear. Young people had to hide how they felt and couldn't trust their feelings, all because successful relationships could get you in trouble. This whole situation didn't just affect people back then. It left a mark that lasted way beyond the Middle Ages. The fear and shame around passionate love and the idea that it could be something supernatural or dangerous stuck around for a really long time. Back in the day, people were really suspicious about the whole idea of falling in love. They thought if you had a successful relationship, there had to be more to it than just liking each other. This way of thinking stuck around in European culture for a long time. Understanding this history shows us not only how much progress we've made in seeing romantic love as something natural and wonderful, but also how these old fears got really stuck in Western culture. The fear of love magic from medieval times might seem strange to us now, but we can still see bits of it in today's worries about sexuality, romance, and sharing our feelings. The people who dared to love back then, even with all these scary beliefs around them, were kind of like heroes. They didn't just go against what society expected or put themselves in danger. They fought against a culture that made them feel like their feelings were wrong. Their bravery shows just how strong love can be, even when everything around it is trying to squash it down. Now, when we look back at how relationships used to be, it's pretty shocking. Basically, the whole setup for love and dating was based on suffering, weird beliefs, and people telling you what to do. But one of the worst things was that most people had no say in who they got to be with. Today, we think it's normal to choose who we date or marry because we love them, but back in medieval times, that could actually get you in trouble. Let's imagine a young girl named Margaret from 14th century England. By the time she was 12, her whole future was already decided. Her dad, who was just a poor farmer tied to the land, would have had to arrange everything for her. Margaret was stuck in a marriage arrangement that she had no say in. Her future husband, Thomas, was chosen because his family had a bit more land and an extra ox, not because she liked him. They barely knew each other, only having met a few times at the village well. The whole deal was about making sure her family could farm better, not about what Margaret wanted. Nobody asked her opinion. In those times, the idea of a woman choosing her own husband was seen as wrong and even dangerous. According to the church, a woman wanting to pick her partner was as bad as the sin that got humanity kicked out of Eden. Margaret was expected to just go along with it, happy that she was being taken care of. But marrying Thomas was far from a blessing. He was known for his bad temper and drinking problem. His last wife had suffered a lot because of him, having miscarried twice and then dying young after a difficult childbirth. Despite the talk around the village about Thomas's harsh ways, no one stepped in. Back then, a man had the right, both legally and according to the church, to discipline his wife however he saw fit. So, when Margaret turned 14, her wedding day wasn't happy at all. It was something she just had to get through, a small and joyless ceremony that marked the start of a difficult life with Thomas. Margaret couldn't understand the Latin words the priest was saying as she stood next to Thomas, her hands shaking. But it wasn't excitement she was feeling, it was pure terror. The ceremony was about to legally hand over her body and soul from her dad to Thomas, who was practically a stranger to her. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret's yes was so quiet. It was almost like she didn't say anything at all. But really, she didn't see any other choice. This wasn't about agreeing. It was about surrendering to a system that didn't give her any other options. The wedding party afterwards was simple, but pretty telling of the whole situation. Margaret was quiet and looked really pale, while the men from both families drank a lot and made inappropriate jokes about what was going to happen later. Thomas's mom gave out some pretty old-fashioned advice on being a good wife, while Margaret's own mom just cried into her drink. No one seemed to care how Margaret felt about any of this. To them, she was just something that belonged to her husband now, to do with as he pleased. This lack of say in matters of the heart wasn't just a problem for regular folks. It was the same story for the high and mighty. Take Princess Isabella of France and the future King Edward II of England. Isabella was only 6 when they decided she'd marry Edward, but she didn't even meet him until the day they got married, 12 years later. By then, their lives were already mapped out by agreements and political deals they had no say in. Isabella and Edward's marriage was a total mess. Edward wasn't really into Isabella and spent most of his time with his male friends, who had a lot of say in the kingdom. Isabella was stuck in a loveless marriage with a king who didn't seem to care about his duties or his wife. Even though she was royalty, Isabella was just as stuck. She couldn't leave Edward, couldn't divorce him. She couldn't do anything, really. Margaret the peasant and Isabel the princess might have lived worlds apart, but they shared one common reality. Marriage in the medieval times was more about ownership and control than love or companionship. For a wife, marriage meant giving up everything, her body, identity, and even her name. She had to move into her husband's home, becoming legally invisible. Her belongings, debts, and children all became his. If she tried to resist or show any independence, she could face severe consequences, including violence or imprisonment, all legally justified. This oppressive system was supported at every level of society. The church preached that women's submission was a sacred duty, painting those who sought independence as sinners walking the path of Eve towards damnation. Legally, women were practically powerless, unable to own property, enter contracts, or make decisions about their own lives. Even the so-called medical experts of the time viewed women as inferior, prone to emotional instability and intellectual deficiencies due to their wandering wombs. But the enforcement of this system wasn't just through laws and preachings. The threat of social and economic fallout was ever present. A woman who didn't marry, left an abusive husband, or simply had romantic desires that went against her family's wishes would be ostracized. Cut off from any social support, women in such positions faced dire consequences, as isolation could mean a death sentence in a world where they had almost no rights or opportunities to make a living. Despite the heavy price, there were women who dared to challenge this system. Marjorie Kemper, a 14th century Englishwoman, is one example. She experienced religious visions and bravely resisted the oppressive norms of her time, but not without facing severe backlash. Her story, like many others, highlights the enormous cost of defiance in a world rigged against women's independence and autonomy. Marjorie felt a deep calling towards a life of spiritual devotion, despite being married and having 14 children. She managed to convince her husband to take a vow of chastity, allowing her to focus fully on her religious path. However, this decision didn't sit well with her community. She faced accusations of heresy, threats of being burned at the stake, and constant criticism for not sticking to her roles as a wife and mother. Sometimes, even her own family saw her spiritual visions as madness or signs of demonic possession. The story of medieval romance is really a tale of how people had no say in matters of the heart. The system wasn't about fostering love or happiness, but about keeping social order and holding on to power. Young folks were just chess pieces in the big game of politics and economics, their personal feelings and needs ignored. This disregard for what people wanted in their romantic lives led to a lot of psychological distress. Chronicles from that time are full of stories about depression, suicidal thoughts, and violent outbursts from men and women forced into marriages they didn't want. Many just withdrew, accepting their lot with a sort of deadened acceptance that let them get by, but not really live. Some turned their frustration towards religious extremes, self-punishment, or other self-destructive acts. This gave them a feeling of control over their pain. The medieval idea of courtly love, which celebrated unfulfilled passion between knights and married ladies, acted as a sort of fantasy getaway from the harsh reality of actual medieval marriages. It gave people a way to dream of something different, even if they couldn't have it in their real lives. To imagine what love might feel like if it were based on choice, mutual attraction, and emotional connection, rather than economic necessity and social obligation. But this fantasy was tinged with tragedy and doom, reflecting the deep understanding that true romantic freedom was simply impossible within the constraints of medieval society. As we reach the end of our exploration into why dating was a nightmare in medieval times, we must confront the sobering reality that for most people living in that era, what we would recognize as dating simply did not exist. There was no period of courtship where young people could get to know each other, discover compatibility, or develop genuine affection. There were no opportunities for private conversation, shared activities, or the gradual building of emotional intimacy that we consider essential to healthy romantic relationships. Instead, there was only the grim machinery of social control grinding forward with inexorable efficiency to sort people into predetermined roles and relationships that serve the needs of the powerful while crushing the spirits of Eve. Rionel's love, when it existed at all, was something that might develop after marriage, if couples were extraordinarily fortunate, but it was never the foundation upon which relationships were built, and it was certainly never considered as sufficient reason to challenge the established order in our modern world. For all its flaws and complications, we have at least established the principle that people should have the right to choose their own romantic partners to marry for lover, rather than obligation, and to leave relationships that make them miserable. The freedoms, which we often take for granted, would have seemed like impossible dreams to our medieval ancestors. They represent centuries of struggle against systems of oppression and control that once seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the stones of the great cathedrals. When we complain about the difficulties of modern dating, the awkwardness of first meetings, the challenge of finding compatible partners, the pain of romantic rejection, we should remember Margaret trembling at their wedding to a man she feared, and Isabella trapped in a loveless marriage to a king who ignored her. We should remember all the countless individuals whose names history has forgotten, who lived and died without ever experiencing the simple joy of choosing to be with someone who truly cared for them. The nightmare of medieval dating was not just about the practical hardships we've explored throughout this series, the disease, the violence, the superstition, and the social constraints. It was about the fundamental denial of human dignity and agency in matters of the heart. It was about a world where love was considered dangerous, choice was forbidden, and happiness was sacrificed on the altar of social stability and political necessity. In understanding this dark chapter of human history, we can better appreciate not only how far we've come, but how precious and fragile our modern freedoms truly are. Based on the script summary and reference files, here's part 11 of the 12-part script for why dating was a nightmare in medieval times. As the shadows of the medieval world grew longer and the specter of mortality loomed ever closer, love itself became perhaps the most dangerous gamble of all. For in this harsh realm, where death could strike without warning, where accusations could destroy lives in an instant, and where the very act of survival consumed every waking hour, the pursuit of romantic connection was fraught with perils that would terrify even the bravest souls. Consider, if you will, the plight of young Margaret, a peasant girl of 17 summers who had caught the eye of Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice in our modern world. Such a courtship might begin with casual conversation, perhaps a coffee date, maybe some innocent text messages. But in Margaret's world, the simplest expression of mutual attraction, could spiral into accusations of witchcraft, demonic possession, or moral corruption that could end with both lovers burning at the stake. The Church's iron grip in matters of the heart meant that love was not seen as a beautiful emotion to be celebrated, but as a dangerous weakness that could lead souls astray. Priests warned from their pulpits that romantic passion was nothing more than the devil's snare designed to corrupt the faithful and drag them down to eternal damnation. Young people were taught that physical desire was inherently sinful, that thinking about someone in a romantic way could condemn their immortal souls. For women, especially, the expression of any romantic feeling was walking a tightrope of social destruction. If a young woman showed too much interest in a man, she might be labeled a temptress or seductress. If she seemed too knowledgeable about matters of love or attraction, whispers would begin that she must be practicing love magic or consorting with supernatural forces. The line between normal human emotion and suspected witchcraft was so thin it was practically invisible. And what of the physical realities of medieval romance in a world without modern hygiene, without understanding of disease transmission, without the most basic medical knowledge? Intimate relationships were literally life-threatening endeavors. Sexually transmitted diseases ran rampant through medieval populations, often leading to painful, lingering deaths that were seen as divine punishment for moral transgression. Women faced the constant terror of pregnancy in an age when childbirth was essentially a coin flip between life and death. The very concept of consent, which we consider fundamental to health. Your relationships today barely existed in medieval legal or social frameworks. Women were considered property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands. A woman's desires, preferences, or feelings about potential romantic partners were not just irrelevant, they were potentially dangerous if they conflicted with the economic or political arrangements made by the men who controlled her life, even for those fortunate enough to win genuine love within the constraints of their society. The constant threat of separation loomed. Large wars could tear lovers apart at a moment's notice, with men conscripted into armies that might march hundreds of miles away, never to return. Plagues could sweep through communities claiming one partner, while sparing the other, leaving behind only grief and memories. Economic hardship could force families to make devastating choices about which children to keep fed and which to send away. The emotional toll of such uncertainty was crushing. Imagine trying to build a loving relationship while knowing that at any moment your beloved could be accused of heresy, or dragged away by soldiers, struck down by disease, or simply disappear into the vast, dangerous wilderness that lay beyond every village. The psychological stress of such constant threat would be overwhelming by any standard. Yet medieval people were expected to simply accept this as the natural order of things. For those who did manage to marry, the challenges were from over. Medieval marriages were business arrangements, first and foremost designed to consolidate wealth, secure political alliances, or ensure economic survival. Love, if it developed at all, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than the foundation of the relationship. Couples were expected to produce children quickly and frequently, regardless of their emotional connection or physical compatibility. The home itself offered little sanctuary for romantic feeling. Medieval houses were cramped, cold, and utterly lacking in privacy. Extended families, servants, and even lives often shared the same living spaces. The idea of intimate moments between spouses was largely theoretical. When children-in-laws and farm animals were constant witnesses to every interaction, romance requires some degree of privacy and comfort, luxuries that were virtually unknown to all. But the wealthiest nobles, and the language of love was constrained by back in medieval times. The fancy poetry and complex rituals of romance were things only the rich could afford. They were all about chasing a love you could never have, rather than finding a real partner. Ordinary folks had to keep things straightforward and often mixed up love with religious or economic matters. Life back then was tied closely to farming schedules, which even decided when people got married or started dating. Often, young couples would be thrown together during the busiest times, with no chance to really get to know each other before they had to settle down. What's more, life was pretty short back then, with most people living only until their 30s or 40s. Because of diseases, accidents, and violence, even if you found love, you might not have long to enjoy it. This constant reminder of death made every sweet moment bittersweet, knowing it couldn't last long. This kind of stress, with no real way to deal with it or even understand it, likely led to a lot of mental health issues that we'd recognize today as depression, anxiety, and chronic stress. But back then, there was no help available, leaving people to cope with these feelings on their own. In the context of medieval times, it's easy to see why so many stories about love from that era are full of desperation, obsession, and tragedy. Love wasn't just something people wanted, it was something they felt they desperately needed. Yet, pursuing it was incredibly risky. The stakes were as high as life and death. Every little show of affection had to be carefully considered, because it could lead to being socially ostracized or even believed to be doomed for eternity. This fear turned what should have been a joyful experience into a source of great anxiety and fear. This was the backdrop against which medieval attitudes towards love and relationships were formed. For hundreds of years, love was seen as the most human desire, but also the most dangerous one. Simply caring for someone could be seen as evidence of moral corruption or blamed on supernatural forces. Women, who were often the target of witchcraft accusations and moral criticism, were paradoxically also expected to take the lead in love and do most of the emotional work. These medieval views on love and sexuality didn't just vanish after the Middle Ages. They continued to shape Western culture's approach to romance, marriage, and gender roles for centuries. Ideas that female sexuality was dangerous, that romantic passion was questionable morally, and that love should come second to practical matters were all born in the tough times of the medieval era. These ideas affected how people thought about and approached relationships well into modern times. Despite all these challenges, love found a way to survive. Between all the social pressures and fears of supernatural retribution, love persisted. People would steal moments together amidst their struggle for survival, exchange looks across busy market squares, and show each other small acts of kindness and protection. Medieval love might have been restricted, often threatened, and sometimes tragically short-lived, but it endured. It stands as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of human affection. We've taken a deep dive into the grim realities of medieval Scotland, a place where life was a constant battle for survival. This era was marked by endless clan warfare, blood feuds, widespread poverty among the peasantry, the heavy hand of the church, and devastating plagues that ravaged the land. It's a picture of relentless hardship, no doubt. But as we wrap up this exploration of one of Scotland's darkest periods, let's not forget the silver linings. Despite everything, there were signs of hope and humanity. People back then showed incredible resilience. The common folk, with their quiet dignity, endured hardships generation after generation. The bonds of kinship and community acted as a lifeline, helping people survive the harshest winters. And then there was the indomitable spirit of independence, which laid the groundwork for the nation we know today. Life for the medieval Scots was undoubtedly tough, and most lives were short and filled with difficulties. However, their legacy lives on in Scotland's character. The nation's fierce pride, its ability to bounce back from adversity, and its strong sense of identity all stem from those challenging times. Their struggles were not for nothing. They set the stage for a freer, more prosperous Scotland. So, as we drift off to sleep, let's pay tribute to those forgotten souls who walked the land before us. Let's appreciate how far we've come from those dark, desperate times.